One incredible characteristic of us humans that AI will never be able to replace is our sense of empathy and compassion.
Around the world, a quiet unraveling is happening. Governments are pulling back from global aid, agencies are shutting down, and for millions of people, their safety net is vanishing. What does it mean for them, but also for all of us? Today on Sense-Making Conversations, I'm joined by Nicholas Haan, development economist, systems thinker, and long-term leader in humanitarian innovation. Nicholas has worked on the front lines of famine prevention and disaster response, and now he's watching the very system he's worked on for decades collapse, but not without seeing a way forward. In this conversation, we talk about what's really at stake, why the aid system needed to change, and how technology, values, and bold thinking might just help us rebuild something stronger. I'm Andrea Sampson, and welcome to Sense-Making Conversations. Welcome, Nick. It's so good to have you here with me. I'm excited to jump into our really, I think, important conversation. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Andrea. How are you?
I'm great. And you know, we're living in some really interesting times, and I know your work looks at these times through so many different lenses. As I look at the work that you're doing in the world and the expertise that you have with some of the changes that have recently happened in our world, there's a big shift that we've all just recently seen in the US with the collapse of USAID and the uncertainty for its future. Because of the work that you do, I would love it if you could help our listeners understand what are some of the implications of that change in the US and how else is it playing out in the world?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And maybe just to frame a little bit the perspectives that I look at that from, because I actually look at it from very different perspectives that normally don't come together. So one of them is with this lens of technology, being a faculty member at Singularity University and very much looking at what are these, what we call exponential technologies, making pretty much everything not only susceptible to disruption, but better, faster, cheaper, and democratizing that technology so that anybody, anywhere has access to powerful technology. So there's that lens. So I go around the world advising corporations and governments and entrepreneurs and investors on that. I also look at it from a lens of many decades of working in the global humanitarian space. So I do very esoteric work. I'm a global food security analyst, meaning when there's a big disaster somewhere, I get involved. And I analyze the severity of that disaster. And I provide that information to decision makers who then make, $1 million, billion-dollar decisions on where to allocate that aid. So two touch points there. So one, I created the what is called the global standard for classifying food insecurity in the world, which is a scale like a Richter scale to be able to detect when places are at the very extreme end of that, like famine. And I also sit on a committee of 5 people, which analyzes when a place might be in famine. For example, Gaza, we did analysis. Sudan, we've done analysis, and we just declared famine or classified famine in Sudan. And we do it anywhere in the world where there's severe food insecurity. So I frame it that way because I look at this question of what are the implications of USAID's shutting down on global humanitarian issues from that lens of technology disruption and true care and understanding of the implications and value of humanitarian response. So I look at it from those two lenses. And I'll say it's really two conclusions. The immediate effects of USAID shutting down will cost lives. It's
Wow.
kind of it's staggering to think that way. If you want some good analysis on that, Nicholas Kristof did a great piece in the New York Times just 2 weeks ago, like really showing, this is how many lives are likely to be lost this year from lack of vaccines or HIV/AIDS or food insecurity or what have you. And it's millions, right? So literally millions of people who are living now and would be living a year from now will not be living a year from now because USAID, the US government, decided to withhold funds. Some people may say, all right, well.
And I would think probably some of the hardest.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add into that now, just in terms of that, what you were just saying with people dying. And ultimately, when we see these types of mass shifts where it affects people at a food level, it's children who are most often most hardest hit.
You're absolutely right. It's children, it's women, vulnerable women. It's people who, and by the way, the most severe crises we have in the world as far as food security is concerned is usually conflict driven. Like, so obviously Gaza, Sudan, these are conflict driven crises.
Of course.
These are people who had nothing to do with that conflict whatsoever. They're innocent people.
Right.
Coming back to the implications of USAID closing, there will be millions of them who will die this year because of that. Some people would argue, well, maybe that's not our responsibility. That's responsibility elsewhere. Other people would argue, well, no, there's strategic reasons why we should care. In terms of global security, there's financial reasons we should care because these problems evolve into much bigger issues that take more money to deal with later on. And then there's just the moral imperative, right? The sense of solidarity that I would like to think that humanity doesn't lose, especially in this day and age of people worried about AI. Well, let's worry about AI replacing our humanity. And we have to fight for that. We have to fight for that sense of solidarity with anybody, anywhere. And we should be living in an abundant world where we are all connected and all people can thrive. So that's that one perspective. The other perspective, though, and this comes from my Silicon Valley kind of sense, is, you know what? That whole international aid industry was ready for disruption. It needed to be disrupted.
Yeah.
It wasn't as efficient or effective as it could be by any stretch, financially efficient or effective in terms of, well, let's stop just doing Band-Aid solutions and let's deal with some underlying causes and make sure we're not doing this over and over. So it was ripe for disruption. People don't like disrupt. It's really interesting, whether you're an organization or a country or an industry or a sector, people don't like disruption. They don't like to do that on their own. Oftentimes it has to come from elsewhere, just like COVID disrupted things. And all of a sudden we were able to do remote work. Well, now USAID shutting down is disrupting that whole global aid industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry per year, providing assistance to hundreds of millions of people in the world. Now is an opportunity for us, people in the industry, to rethink that. Rethink, how can that industry be redeveloped from the bottom up in a much more efficient way?
I love where you're going with this. I agree with you. When we look at not just USAID, but I think international aid, it has not shifted or changed in a very long time. The approach to it, the rationale for it, the way in which we do it and conduct it. So it was in need of reform. There's no question, and I think that everyone would certainly say that, anyone who has looked at this issue in any depth, where the way in which this has happened, maybe it's not ideal. And I think we can agree on that. I mean, certainly where people are being left without hope or without any support, that's not great. But when we look at areas that are ready for disruption, I mean, what we're really talking about, this is not just a change in policy in one government. I think what we're seeing, and maybe we can agree on, is this is a systemic change across many different industries. And, as somebody who's worked in Silicon Valley, I mean, what we know is disruption will feel very difficult at first. It will feel sometimes like the bottom has fallen out of our world. But that's the opportunity to rebuild, to create, and not just rebuild, but reimagine and think about what the world needs today versus what it needed 20, 30, 50 years ago when some of these systems were put in place. So, if this, and I think we can agree, it was ripe for disruption. As we rethink this moment quickly, how can we use some of the knowledge of those in Silicon Valley, the exponential technologies? I mean, you and I both have done extensive work with Singularity University and their massive, vision of impacting the world's most vulnerable people and finding solutions to the world's biggest problems. So how can we apply those technologies? What can we do? Is technology a support in this, or is it just a distraction for something that really just needs more money thrown at it?
I think that this is an opportunity to reinvent the global humanitarian industry. I do think the Silicon Valley, and it's not just Silicon Valley, but innovators anywhere in the world have that mindset of, well, let's use first principles thinking. Let's reverse engineer. Let's use these very powerful design concepts to say, okay, what's the problem we need to solve? And actually ask that question. And as you know, in design thinking, ask the right question. So in other words, if the question is, if I'm a food aid agency and my job is to move food from the United States to a remote place, my question might be, how can I move that food aid better, faster, cheaper? Right? That's a fair question. But if my question is, how can I ensure that this most vulnerable person in the world is not vulnerable year in, year out? That brings to bear a whole different set of solutions and issue. It's a much bigger question. So now is an opportunity for us to ask the big questions, the right questions, and recognize that technology does give us a whole new suite of tools that we can use to create solutions which are better, faster, cheaper, much more efficient and effective. So, and concepts too, such as, so very simply in the aid industry, as in many industries, there's many different layers of agents and gatekeepers before you get down to the person who receives the aid. So at the top of there might be a government like USAID, and then there's an international UN agency and an international NGO, then a national NGO, then another one, and then people. And by the time it gets down to people, it's a fraction of the amount of money that was given at the top that actually benefits people. Flavor of the day is disintermediating, right? So this is a huge opportunity to disintermediate all of those agents. Well, not necessarily all of them. Some of them are doing really important value chain additions, but figure out really what those are and make aid much more efficient. And now with technology, we have the ability to have direct connections wherever you are in the world as a donor entity, direct connections to communities and to households and to individuals, direct, right? Via telecommunications, even Starlink and whatnot in the most remote places. In Sudan, for example, extremely remote places, the telecommunications industry is collapsed, but Starlink is there and people are able to access Starlink to the degree that they can to be able to stay connected. We can use blockchain technologies to disintermediate many different layers and literally from the donor right to an individual, provide funds in their wallet so then they can be able to purchase food locally. That's a radically different way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's never been, really never been possible before, in the world that has, that where many of these legacy systems were built. And I think, we've gone through these disruptions that technology, if we think about banking as a good example of that, and we're talking about something that is financially based. And of course, banking has had to go through quite a reform and is still going through it. And certainly with things like blockchain and when we get into then cryptocurrency, we're seeing even another, generation of challenge to our banking and finance industry. Well, but how might that play out, to your point, in the world of international aid? And when we look at blockchain, because of its ability to be one-to-one with no interference, it really does provide, I remember working with another SU faculty, Anne Connolly, who you probably know. And I remember her telling this story because she used to do it. She worked in charities in remote places. And she talked about having to actually literally bring backpacks full of cash into these places to give out aid because people didn't have bank accounts, right? And so the only way to actually provide them with aid was actually to show up with cash in hand. And of course, the risk of that, the danger to the person doing that, the danger to the system was huge. And so, I think the ability to disrupt this system is really important. And getting aid into the hands of those who need it is important. But when you look at where we are in this moment, what's your feeling in terms of, are we going down a path towards that? Is it, because I think there's a lot of rhetoric in the market which says, as humans, we like to live in these binary places. Either we give aid or we don't. And I don't think that's true. I think there's probably lots of middle ground in there. But when we look at what's going on in the world, do you feel comfortable or have some confidence that we are going through a disruption? Or is this just a removal of something for the sake of saving money?
I think there is a risk of that. It's a removal of, there's a risk of it be removed to save money only if people turn a blind eye to human suffering elsewhere in the world. One incredible characteristic of us humans that AI will never be able to replace is our sense of empathy and compassion. We have this inherent sense of solidarity. Once we know of human suffering somewhere, it's very hard to look away. And at the same time, we have within the humanitarian world, we have the increasing intersection of the innovator mindset coming into the humanitarian world. This has been going on really like for the last 10 years, I would say, at pace and increasing. So the innovator mindsets are young people who are innovative, not just necessarily young people, but anyone who has an innovator's mindset. And it's not just technology, but technology plays a big part of this as well. People who are innovating with technologies. And very importantly, this is in line with the notion of democratization of technology. Innovators can come from the places where the suffering is happening. People there can create new financial services or new services to use generative AI for educational purposes and roll that out. They don't need to wait for someone from Silicon Valley to do that. They could do that there, because that's the amazing thing about democratization of technology and democratization of innovation, empowerment, right? So this is happening. To your question, yes, USAID is shutting down, and yes, it's going to have immediate horrific effects on some people's lives. And it's extremely saddening for me because I'm really up close and personal with that. I count deaths. It's that bad. But at the same time,
I mean, you live in some of these areas.
I do. So I live in East Africa over 30 years.
So you see it firsthand.
And I've spent many years in some of these most affected areas. And yes, so that's my way of life. But what I see is an opportunity to bring to literally this vision of, say, the Peter Diamandis sort of mindset of democratization of technology. It is happening, without a doubt. And I think that we're still on that low side of the exponential curve. There will be an explosion of opportunities and innovations to be able to, for anybody anywhere, to have solidarity with someone in the world who's suffering and be able to either directly themselves or go through a trusted agent to be able to assist that person.
I love what you're suggesting there. I mean, it really is the decentralization approach, right? Where it's like, well, let's take that middleman out. We don't need to have all of these layers in between. I could send money to somebody I don't even know directly through some of these technologies. And I think, how empowering is that? Because, as to your point, as somebody who cares deeply about what's happening in the world, and many of us do, I'm not alone, you do, and many more people. Yes, we see all of these tragic things happening that are out of our control because there are policymakers and lawmakers and governments who are, in fact, doing this work. And it feels out of integrity with how I specifically show up in the world or what my values are. And like I said, there's many of us like that. But the fact that we've got technology today that can allow us to circumvent all of these policymakers and lawmakers and not do anything illegal, but in fact, go directly to the place where the problem lives and provide support in ways that would be right for us. And that's, yes, I can do it as an individual. I could do it as a business. I can do it as a community even. I mean, these are things that have just never been available to us before. One of the things that I've learned about exponential technologies and innovation in general is that, often we're borrowing lessons from other areas. Like we learn something in a completely unrelated area. And then we say, well, what if we took that lesson and applied it to what we're doing right here? As you look out, like, are there lessons that we can apply right now that would help us to get through some of this? Not just as, again, governments and lawmakers, because I think they have their own issues. They've got their own ways of doing these things. And, but it really comes down to those of us who actually do want to make a difference and are trying to make sense of what is going on in the world. What models, what approaches can we take into our everyday and say, no matter what's happening over there, and I want to help people not die in famine, in a famine, or help to support the growth and innovation of burgeoning areas that were just getting off the ground and now will sort of fall back flat without help. What lessons can we apply so that we can see a new way of doing things?
Well, first and foremost is not to give up on hope and solidarity with each other, and not to tune out and turn the other way. That's the first foremost important. A riddle that I sometimes say to myself, and this is a weird, strange riddle. It's a rather macabre riddle, but you've probably heard the riddle: if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Okay. And I've always thought when I was a kid, well, yeah, even if I don't hear it, it must be making a sound out there because there's vibrations and it's going to affect things. So my answer ever since I was a young kid hearing that riddle is yes, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's around, it makes a sound. But in the case of someone literally dying of hunger, they don't make sounds. Literally, the body just dies. And it's important for us to acknowledge that just because USAID is shutting down, just because the U.S. government might be turning its attention elsewhere to situations which are more geopolitically favorable to it, which is its prerogative. For those who care about solidarity and compassion, those people are still suffering in this world. And for those of us who have the ability, who are blessed with some ability to share or to, and it's not just resources, but also to use whatever platform we have to help create visibility and attention on people's plight. Or if we're the innovator group, like how can I get involved and maybe use my innovator's mindset to think about how to move financial transfers in a not just an efficient way, but in these contexts, a very safe way for people. And there are many other cultural considerations and whatnot. But this is a fantastic innovator's challenge to think about how to move humanitarian assistance. And it's not just money, by the way. So another startup that I launched a long time ago, but I've since stepped away from, but it's now taking off, is called Field Ready. And they do digital manufacturing or 3D printing in the field for after disasters. So think Myanmar, the earthquake that just happened. So they would be out there helping to create, to not just spare parts, but other essential things that are needed. And what they do is they train people on how to use these digital manufacturing techniques locally. And then they leave equipment there so that then they leave behind a capacitated group of people. And that's the kind of innovator's mindset, which I think we're just scratching the surface on. So it's not just money, but it's all kinds of water. For example, water and sanitation is a huge challenge in these environments. That's still waiting for some very viable solutions to have more clean water, more sanitary services, et cetera. Energy is another one. Telecommunications is another one. All of these sectors, which people are vital to people's well-being, are ready for radical innovations that make them not just better, faster, cheaper, but appropriate in these extreme environments. All right, so you're not solving for some place down the street in California. You're solving for some place where it's in a very extreme environment, but people need those services.
And so what I'm hearing and what I love about this is, again, I go back and right now a void has been created, right? With the withdrawal of funds, there's a void created in the world. And so we have the ability to fill that void today. And again, it's not just a void of money, but it's a void of solutions, right? Because
Yeah.
I think one of the problems that we've had in the aid market is that it has been seen as primarily a financial transaction. When in fact, when we look at places that are in desperate need of many things, money is only one part of it. So whether it be access to technology, access to tools, access to clean water, access to thinking resources who can help them learn, these are all areas where different types of aid can come in. And when we think about that void, all of those tools, if we will, exist. So there are, like you gave the example of 3D printing. And, I remember years ago hearing about some of the work that was done on 3D printing in space to create tools on an as needed basis, while in a obviously you can't just go down to the local hardware store and buy a wrench. How do you get a wrench? Well, you have to create it. Well, the same is true in a disaster-stricken area. You don't have access to these things. So bringing the ability to be self-sufficient through 3D printing is in fact more valuable than money in that case, because it allows them to take care of themselves, to grow, to thrive. And that's one small example of what different types of aid that already exist. If we just take solutions that already exist and apply them to these places that are deep in need, we're already filling probably 3/4 of the void that has been created. And it creates more resilience, because I think that's the other issue is when we look at the void that was created, it was going to happen one way or another. I mean, it's happened in a way that maybe we wouldn't have liked, but the reality is it was not sustainable. And so what we're talking about now are sustainable practices. So as you think about that, as you think about the, out with the old system, in with a new system, in your mind, I mean, because you do work on this on a fairly regular basis, what does that, is it are we going back to government stepping in, or is there a new model that's starting to be born here?
I think what's going to happen as far as governments are concerned is, or fortunately, depending upon your perspective, governments will play a more what's in my geopolitical interest role for humanitarian assistance. I used to be a Peace Corps volunteer. I come from the school of like, okay, how much good can I do in the world? Just because I thought that was a good thing. And I thought I was representing the U.S. government as a Peace Corps volunteer because I thought at that time, they just wanted to help the world. I think the world is changing, at least right now in this period of time. I don't know if that's going to be enduring or if it's just this administration, but there's going to be a strong realignment to what's in our geopolitical interest. I also think that the notion of, as far as the aid industry is concerned, the notion of being primarily led by Western country donors, so U.S. government, European countries, have been major players in that. I think we're going to see the emergence of other countries, Arab countries, and China is going to be playing a bigger role as seeing themselves as, contributing to the global humanitarian sphere. I don't know how much of that is going to be purely humanitarian or, again, aligned to strategic objectives. I think what's going to happen, though, is there's going to be a re-emergence of civil society, creating awareness, activating people for action and doing that action directly, because you don't need to go through a government as far as a donor is concerned. It gets complicated, by the way, when you're actually, when you're providing assistance to wherever those people are, there is a government and that has to be navigated, but that's a different story. But I'm just talking about the supply side of this. I think civil society has always been there. International NGOs, great NGOs like Oxfam and Care and Save the Children and others have been there. I think they're going to play a bigger role. And I think what they're going to do is rely less on government funding and more on civil society to support them. But I think there's going to be a social contract. And the social contract is going to be, we'll give you money, but do this in a much more efficient, effective, and sustainable way. So that'll be the challenge, is how to be much more efficient, effective, and sustainable. What are you doing to actually create long-term solutions to these problems? So let me give you an example, a little story. A couple of years ago, I was in what's called an internally displaced persons camp. It's like a refugee camp, IDP camp in Somalia, where people were destitute. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people just absolutely destitute. And they're living in very simple plastic sheet tents in remote places and depending upon what little assistance they were able to receive. And I was out there doing a field assessment to figure out how severe the situation was. So here I was in this remote place, sitting on the ground, talking to some women, some Somali women, and I would ask them about their lives and they would tell me. And at the end of a long interview, I would always ask a crazy question. And that crazy question, because I noticed behind the women that I'm interviewing would be some young women, like 15, 16-year-old women. And I'd say, what are your hopes and dreams? After talking about barely having enough food to eat the next day, I would actually say, what are your hopes and dreams?
Right.
Can you tell me what your hopes and dreams are? And these are people who would have been displaced from their farms and their pastoral areas, hundreds of kilometers away due to conflict and to drought, and they're destitute. And every single one of them would respond, my hope and dream is to go back to my pastoral livelihood. But it would be, my hope and dream is to get an education, get a certificate so I can learn and get a job. Right? It's a completely different mind. So here I am in this IDP camp, complete destitution and extreme poverty everywhere, like the most extreme poverty you can imagine. And when people get robbed, as they do, what's the first thing they purchase? A cell phone. Is they purchase a cell phone. And where in this refugee camp that I'm sitting, amongst all this destitution, right there is a cell phone tower. Now, with that cell phone and that cell phone tower, if that cell phone is a dumb smartphone, cheap, dumb smartphone, anyone, anywhere now has access to powerful generative AI, ChatGPT. They can get, they can have therapy. They can have educational access. They can engage in the global economy and in global digital economy. So my mindset was, you know what?
Well, did they know that? Do they know that? Like,
no.
So, as you're telling this story, like, it's blowing me away, right? No, they're buying this cell phone, but they don't even know what power they have in their hand.
Correct. That's exactly my point, is the chasm between what is possible and the reality is so close that if we just connect these two, if we just change the mindset of the international aid community so that we see our role as actually fast-tracking the digital empowerment of people in the world. So my mindset is the poorest people in the world should be the ones who benefit from exponential technologies the most. And we just have to connect that so that people understand that they are connected to global commerce, education, what have you, just like you and I are, actually. So I see that as the future role of international aid industries is to promote that and for us to actually turn this poverty story on its head so that people actually are empowered to generate income for themselves. It might, but very modest income, but enough to feed themselves and enough to get healthcare and get water.
Right.
And I think this is very doable. And we're not. It's a failure of imagination. I'm just speaking as an international aid industry person. It's a failure of our imagination, and I think it's inevitable that transformation does happen.
Well, as I'm listening to you, what's coming to my mind as a new model, as you said, here you're talking to these women in these displaced persons camps who are destitute. And what are their hopes and dreams is to get an education, to get a job, to do something different than what got them where they are, because the pastoral agricultural life that they were living got them to where they are in their mind. Whether that's true or not, there's a connection there. Mm-hmm. And your point of what do they want? What's the first thing that happens when they are given a small amount of money is they buy a cell phone, and that cell phone gives them access. Now, what comes to my mind is the model that we're missing, is the innovation that we're missing. When we look across the world and we say, what is it that's needed in the hands of every person? Are there two things? Access to the internet and some form of tool to create that access, whether it be a cell phone or something similar, and then using that to help them see how they can create opportunities for themselves. So whether it be,
Correct.
first of all, access to education, so is that,
Mhm.
is this, so when we look at the world of international aid, and where we have been has been in a very transactional place, where I think I'm hearing you take us is into more of a community-based or something that's bringing people together. But with that, is there another piece that technology or innovation can play where it says, okay, now we start to use these tools that they want anyway, because they see it, through lenses of what they see as being prosperous. And then we create sort of a global access. Is that something that you think is possible? And if it were, is that something that do you think would make a difference?
Absolutely, I do. There's one more piece of that puzzle that you were putting together that is also important, and that is an energy supply. With solar, that's by and large there.
Right, of
So
course.
if you have energy, you have a tool, and you have internet access, you have access to educate, you have therapy. So you have many people in experiencing, because we're talking about places where people have experienced horrific events, they oftentimes just
Trauma.
need therapy. So
Yeah.
boy, you've got a trauma therapist right there who understands you personally. Education, you can learn according to your own pace of learning. Commerce, you can enter the digital commerce sphere, even if, and I know this is controversial, but playing games, right? Playing crypto games, people can make money these days, right?
Of course.
Filipinos are doing it. It's a bit controversial, play to earn type models, but there are also other ways to get to monetize digital skills on a micro basis. I think one piece of this puzzle that would make it happen beyond aid per se is for there to be a business model associated with this. So if the nut can be cracked, that there
is.
Right. So if the nut can be cracked, that there's actually a value proposition for the data. So the whether it's the hardware or the internet access or what have you, that the data itself is of value to some business entity, that they would help promote the distribution of those essential pieces that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Invest in the, as you mentioned, oftentimes it's a mindset. So there's huge value in having an agent create that awareness and hold your hand a little bit, like, hey, you can do this, you can learn, and help you along that journey.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just like throwing cell phones around in the world and everything's going to be great, but there needs to be the cultural sensitivity of it, the human psychology of learning, and the empowerment. I think that's all doable. It doesn't have to be very expensive, but if there was a business model around that, beyond aid per se, then you'd see this really take off.
I'm reminded of another story, and I don't remember all of the details, but it was the Bicycle Project. The idea behind this was looking at areas that had been impacted, whether it be by disaster or through famine. And one of the issues was women's ability to get water. Women would have to walk for many miles, often every day, to go to the local river, the water supply, bring it back, and they would have to do this multiple times a day. And the issue was that often they would be kidnapped along the way. There was danger. There was a lot of danger. But water, of course, was needed for their village. And a company stepped in. I don't remember which company it was. And they started initially providing bikes to these young women who were having to get water. But the issue with providing bikes was bikes break down. And then what do you do, right? Because, okay, we had it for a little while, but then you got a flat tire or something happens and you can't fix this bike. And so what the company then did was that they actually started, they would bring one person in the village and enable them with a bike repair. And that person was now set up for a commerce. And initially, I think it was free, and then it became something. But the idea was that now what you're doing is you're empowering the entire village. People have bikes, they have transportation. Transportation gets them something more, it gets them something more. And now you've actually got somebody with a small business who's actually doing something more. And so if we take that same idea, to your point, like you can't just throw a cell phone at people and go, well, the problem's solved. Here's a cell phone, here's a battery, and here's some here's access to the internet, off you go. But if we
Mm-hmm.
look at it and we go, okay, well, one of the things we know today, I mean, look, I can't open my email without somebody offering to teach me how to give a course or to want me to buy their course, right? There's no shortage of online learning and it's quality. There's nothing wrong with most of it. I mean, there's probably some that aren't, but many of it is. So these things exist. We've got online universities, we've got access to training, we've got access to trauma therapists. Like all of these things are there. And each one of those has an economic model attached to it already. Now, we can't expect that those who are in need are going to be part of that economic model, but there are those around it, purpose-driven organizations who want to create a difference, who want to step in and rather than donating to large charities, what about creating your own foundation? What about creating your ability to come in? And I think one of the things that's really powerful about this is that in many cases in these areas, part of the challenge was getting people in to help because a lot of times it's even just difficult to get to these places. But now with tools and technology, we've got full avatars. We don't need to actually parachute in and try and take
Correct.
Western values and place it on an area that is traumatized. It can be the training of the one person through technology that then trains the village or the group or the camp. So, just as you hear that, thoughts on it, like, am I crazy? Is there a model there? Or how would you make that better?
No, you're absolutely right. What I call trad aid, traditional aid. So you think TradFi, I call trad aid. The traditional way of doing aid was very supply side and top down. I don't like to use this, like a little bit of a savior complex, like someone from the outside is going to come in and help. And the reason why I don't like to do that is because
Right.
people do really good work and they risk their lives doing really good work. But the point is, it's an outside person coming to help. And supply side, meaning I have something and I'm willing to give it as much as I have something to give, not demand driven and not bottom up and empowering people locally. We can create a demand driven, empowering, bottom up system with these new technologies that we have, telecommunications and to exchange through blockchain or other digital ways of exchanging money. And we can communicate through not just remotely, but we can communicate, as you said, through avatars, which are culturally appropriate to people. And it's with AIs that speak the local dialect of people and do that in a way
Right.
which is religiously appropriate or gender appropriate or culturally appropriate. This is the mindset that we were going in that direction already. I think now with this disruption, it's just going to happen much faster. And it's as if we've opened up the floodgates of innovators and new ways of thinking. And the aid industry, as painful as this is for all the tens of thousands of professionals who've dedicated their lives to global humanitarian work, have done, they've studied for it, they've trained for it, they've devoted their entire professional careers. Now it's totally disrupted. It's painful for them. Let me tell you, it's really, really painful for them. Also an opportunity to rethink how we've been doing things. And maybe for those who still have the appetite for it, to get involved, but with a slightly different way of getting engaged and a different mindset of, now, how can I approach this with an innovator's mindset and a solution-oriented mindset, not a trad aid and band-aid? Now I'm making rhymes. Trad aid and band-aid approach.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Well, I love what you're saying. And I know that we're kind of out of time, but I think we've just hit on something that is so huge and so big. And I think that if anyone who's listening to this, who's working in a large organization or working in an area where they want to provide help, there's deep exploration that needs to happen here in application. Like the thing is, these things already exist. It's just a matter of applying them. Like you said, like think a little bit more out of the box, like get away from that traditional aid mindset. think about this direct aid that can be applied in such a culturally appropriate way, and the exponential impact that it has, because it's not just money. In fact, in many cases, it's not going to be money. It's resources, it's access, it's giving people really what they want, which is their hopes and dreams. I want to have a better life than my parents had. I want to give my children a better life than I have. And look, isn't that all of our best hopes and dreams? I mean, I don't think they're any different no matter where you are in the world. And so if we all have the ability to maybe make a little bit of impact, why wouldn't we, you know?
Absolutely.
Nick, this has
Absolutely.
been such an incredible conversation. I'm going to throw it to you for some last thoughts.
Thank you for giving me a platform to share my views. I care deeply about the global humanitarian mission. I'm braced for impact of what's going to happen, but I'm also optimistic about the disruptions that are going to come so that we can do things in a much more effective way. And I really encourage all of our listeners, don't let our governments decide our barometers of compassion and empathy. We get to be the controllers of that. The notion of human solidarity and connectivity is there. I just don't see that going away. Let's all rethink how we can help each other in this planet and create a prosperous world.
Thank you so much, Nick. This has been incredibly powerful. How can my guests keep in touch with you? Because you clearly are on the cutting edge of some of the most important work that's happening in our world today.
Well, funny enough, I'm not so much on social media. I am available on LinkedIn through Nick J. Haan at LinkedIn. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to have conversations with anybody. It so happens that I, too, am going to be launching a podcast called Disaster Act in the next few months, which is specifically going to be drawing attention to major disasters anywhere in the world and lighting the innovations that can take place in that disaster setting, and to get our community of viewers who are going to be watching that podcast activated to get them a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning and sense of impact on those disasters. So watch out for that.
Amazing, Nick. So Disaster Act coming up in a couple of months, your own podcast, and definitely follow Nicholas Haan on LinkedIn to make sure that you are able to stay in touch with the work he's doing and be one of the first to know about that podcast when it launches. Thank you so much. I so appreciate all of the work that you're doing in the world. What Nicholas makes clear is that we're standing at a critical inflection point, not just in global aid, but in how we respond to human need. The collapse of traditional aid systems like USAID isn't just a funding issue, it's a signal that the way we've done things in the past may no longer serve the world we live in now. But that doesn't mean we have to give up. It means we have to step up with innovation, with compassion, and with the courage to imagine something better. Nicholas reminds us that technology isn't about efficiency. It can also be about equity. And that disruption, while uncomfortable, can open the door to deeper resilience and a more inclusive system if we choose to build them. So what's the call to action? If you work in business, in technology, in policy, this is your moment to look outward. Ask yourself, how can we use what we have to serve those who have the least? And how can we make sure the tools we build are reaching the people who need them the most? Now, if this conversation stirred something in you, make sure to share it. Send it to a colleague, start a discussion, or even post your reflection right here. That's how we help the world make sense of itself together. And don't forget, subscribe so you don't miss any of our future episodes. We've got so many more conversations to unpack, more voices to hear, and more solutions to contribute. This has been Sense-Making Conversations, and I'm Andrea Sampson. And I can't wait to meet you right back here for our next conversation.